Thank you to Middle East Monitor for hosting this event at the British Library, a proper and fitting venue of tribute to a man so committed to expanding knowledge, critical thought, and freedom for his fellow citizens. And to its director, Mr. Dawood Abdallah, for inviting me to address you here today. 1 year ago today, I was in a taxi in Beirut when I received a call from a friend who told me he was on the line with Khadija Jengiz, Jamal Khashoggi's fiancée. She had been waiting outside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and feared he was being detained inside. She was extremely stressed and in a panic, not sure what to do. She had held on to his telephones and had no way to reach him. She wanted to go into the consulate and ask where he was. I urged her to remain where she was as long as possible and to alert and wait for Turkish police and officials. I quickly informed friends at the Washington Post and some other journalists, but otherwise could do nothing more than to pray that he would come out soon. I hoped that with Khadija outside and soon to arrive police, the Saudis would not dare to try to kidnap him, which I thought was the worst that might be planned. I knew Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was trying to badger him to return to Saudi. Jamal had told me about how his proxy, Saud al-Qahtani, and his efforts to woo him back to the country over the past few months, promising that he would be allowed to write again. It took no effort to persuade Jamal to ignore those calls. With each passing month of new arrests and trials of writers, journalists, and scholars since his self-imposed exile, he grew more and more concerned about the Saudi government's expanding intolerance and repression, and certain that the pleas for his return were a trap. It did, however, take more effort to persuade Jamal to take the decision to leave his country. I had started urging him to leave soon after the government banned him from writing or speaking to the media or at conferences and tweeting in December 2016. The imminent reason for his ban from tweeting was his criticism about President Trump's Middle East policies, which he felt were not tough enough on Iran. He thought he could lay low, stay under the radar, avoid antagonizing the authorities, in his words. But I was concerned that he would soon face a surprise travel ban, like so many other Saudis who discovered they couldn't travel when showing up for a routine trip at the airport. When I first urged him to get out before it was too late, he said, "I think about the option all the time. I never wanted to be an opposition figure, just to be free to say what I think is right for my country." I urged Jamal to get advice from two of his close friends and longtime associates, Prince Walid bin Talal and Prince Turki al-Faisal. Prince Walid, he told me, urged him to play it cool and it will pass. Little did he know that he himself would end up infamously detained among the 200 or so other businessmen, media figures, and government officials whom MBS ordered detained in November 2017 at the Ritz-Carlton, just a few months later, and let out only after forfeiting the bulk of his assets, outside of any judicial process, in one of the greatest shakedowns of modern history, with the state claiming it recovered $107 billion, with nary a judge or lawyer involved. We know that several of these men remain detained, including King Abdullah's son and a former governor of Riyadh, Prince Turki bin Abdullah. And even those released, like Prince Walid, appear to be prisoners in their own country, travel banned and house banned. Prince Turki was Jamal's longtime friend and one-time boss. When Jamal worked for him between 2003 to 2010 as his media advisor during Prince Turki's stints as Saudi ambassador to the US and then the UK. In fact, I first met Jamal with Prince Turki in his office back in 2005 when I was trying to persuade the Saudi government to allow Human Rights Watch into the country, as even Libya had done under Gaddafi, and which, by the way, Saudi then agreed to do. Jamal had taken his job after the government forced him to resign from his job as editor of Whitson, also owned by Prince Turki's family, because he had taken too progressive a view on domestic matters. As Jamal explained, perhaps it seems odd to be fired by the government and then serve it abroad, yet that is truly the Saudi paradox. When Jamal talked to Prince Turki about his current plight, they joked about how silly it all was, he told me. What silly advice from Prince Turki. It turns out it was a mistake to expect more from this friend who insisted on defending the Crown Prince and Saudi Arabia from responsibility for murdering Jamal, complaining that the CIA's past lies on Iraq meant they were not credible about this murder. It's not clear why he didn't hold this standard to his government's more recent and outrageous lies about Jamal's murder. I urged Jamal not to wait, to leave sooner rather than later, and assured him that he could return when things calmed down and the situation improved. He showed me photos of his grandchildren, explaining that's why people find it hard to leave their country. But as arrests started to increase and Jamal grew tired and frustrated at the muzzle around his mouth, after 6 months of forced silence, he did finally take the extremely difficult decision to leave in about June of 2017. He explained his decision to leave and speak out in his first column for the Washington Post in September 2017, following a shocking round of arrests of writers, journalists, and scholars, including several of his friends, including the reformist scholar Abdallah al-Odeh, who now faces the death penalty. This, at the time, was the biggest roundup under Mohammed bin Salman's emergence as crown prince since deposing his cousin, Mohammed bin Nayef, who of course is himself now under house arrest and travel ban. Jamal explained his decision to leave in his first column. I have made the different choice now. I have left my home, my family, and my job, and I am raising my voice. To do otherwise would betray those who languish in prison. I can speak when so many cannot. I want you to know that Saudi Arabia has not always been as it is now. We Saudis deserve better. More than anything, Jamal sought the freedom to express his views as a journalist and a thinker about the best course of progress for his country and to advance critical thinking, which he felt was essential to advancement. Jamal openly signaled his dedication to freedom, even if it meant resistance to state oppression, with a poster in his office when he was editor of Al-Hayat. It showed the infamous image of Tank Man, the unidentified protester resisting Chinese tanks in the 1989 Tiananmen uprising for democracy in China. Now, if you've been to Saudi Arabia, you'll understand how astonishing it is to walk into any office and see any image, not just a political image, of anything but portraits of whomever is king and crown prince at the time. But Jamal made no secret that his highest loyalty was to his fellow humans and his Saudi brothers and sisters, first among them all. Jamal was a patriot who wished to live as a free man aside free Saudi women and men. From what he believed to be the safety of his exile, he took on the task of explaining to a global audience the dilemma Saudis like him now faced under the government's new leadership. They were at once supportive of the ambitious reform agenda advertised by the Crown Prince that would limit the powers of the religious establishment, reduce dependence on oil by diversifying the economy, though this was hardly a new plan, and finally grant women basic freedoms like the right to drive. At the same time, they chafed under the lived reality of an unprecedented official repression and intolerance, even against people who supported the reforms, along with an unprecedented concentration of power in the hands of one man, the Crown Prince, extinguishing hopes that political reforms would accompany the fast-moving social and economic reforms. the Crown Prince rather boldly took on the religious establishment, the royal families, and the business establishment. He called the bluff of what were long considered the essential pillars upholding the monarchy in a grand bargain of a uniquely Saudi system of shared power. As observers of Saudi Arabia can tell you, the deep conservatism of the kingdom and the slowness of change in the country resulted in no small part due to this unspoken balance of power, with any king finely attuned to the views and demands of these three pillars. But in fact, these pillars had no actual power, neither institutional nor legal. As I noted following the mass arrests of business leaders and royals, these are people who thought that the country's lack of rights and laws would never really affect them, that they were safe in their privileges and secure in their standing with any king. They learned only too late that nothing but the rule of law and independent institutions can safeguard the rights of citizens, rich or poor, and serve as a check over absolute power. Today, the Crown Prince exercises more absolute, unchecked power over the Saudi people than seen before in Saudi Arabia's history. And yet this dismantlement of the country's independent bases of power has not quenched his thirst for power. He also took on the total silencing and obedience of his citizens, who of course had very little actual influence or power, but had voiced some measure of dissent during the Arab uprisings of 2011. Some dozens, perhaps hundreds of prominent Saudis had petitioned King Abdullah for a more limited constitutional monarchy. Over 14,000 women petitioned King Abdullah for an end to the guardianship system and the ban on women driving. We saw a brief opening of critical expression from Saudi writers, academics, scholars, and journalists. The kingdom's Shia population held a few public protests, demanding an end to their community's systematic discrimination and exclusion. But though Saudi civil society had a very limited voice in their country, even during the region's greatest convulsion for freedom, the Crown Prince wanted to make it clear that Saudi citizens would remain subjects under his rule and not citizens. There would be no role for civil society in the decisions that affected them, no voice for reformers who called for the very same reforms that the Crown Prince was now promoting. And so his first series of mass arrests were against Saudi intellectuals. I want to share with you Jamal's views on Saudi Arabia's domestic and foreign policies, because I think his words are the greatest evidence of his values and point of view. We agreed and disagreed. Jamal said, "We are being asked to abandon any hope of political freedom and to keep quiet about arrests and travel bans that impact not only the critics but also their families. We're expected to vigorously applaud social reforms and heap praise on the Crown Prince while avoiding any reference to the pioneering Saudis who dared to address these issues decades ago. Is there no other way for us? Must we choose between movie theaters and our rights as citizens to speak out, whether in support of or critical of our government's actions? Do we only voice glowing references to our leader's decisions, his vision of our future, in exchange for the right to live and travel freely, for ourselves and our wives, husbands, and children too? I have been told that I need to accept with gratitude the social reforms that I have long called for, while keeping silent on other matters, ranging from the Yemen quagmire, hastily executed economic reforms, the blockade of Qatar, discussions about an alliance with Israel to counter Iran, and last year's imprisonment of dozens of Saudi intellectuals and clerics." Jamal heralded the government's decision to allow women to drive, but highlighted the decades of campaigning by activists and journalists to nudge their country to take this step. Recounting the ban on the media's openly supporting women's right to drive, Jamal described how he published articles in 2007 in Al-Watan depicting women arriving to their jobs on camels, which they weren't banned from riding, and then arriving to work on bicycles, which they were also free to navigate. And while he generously praised the Crown Prince for enacting this reform, he condemned the arrests and ongoing persecution of the activists who had advocated for these choices in what was always a measured, gentle, and respectful tone, couching criticism in an envelope of praise. Jamal said, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman deserves considerable credit for bringing the matter, here referring to the ban on women driving, to a close the right way. While previous leaders were reluctant to take up the issue, he faced it head-on and did the right thing for Saudi Arabia. At the same time, I hope he will not forget the brave actions of each and every Saudi who individually worked hard for freedom and modernization. He should order the release of Hathlul, Aziza al-Yusuf, Iman al-Nafjan, and the other brave women who campaigned for women's rights to drive. They should be allowed to finally witness the results of their tears and toil. In the same vein, Jamal expressed strong support for efforts to rein in corruption in Saudi Arabia, which he saw embedded within most of Saudi Arabia's institutions, a long festering disease actively nurtured by successive monarchs and their royal cohorts. But he condemned the arbitrary and unjust tactics the Crown Prince used in claiming to attack this scourge, and urged the Saudi press to do its job and contribute to the national discussion. So while I applaud the public campaign to end corruption, he said, I call on the Saudi media to assume a proactive role in encouraging impartial and transparent investigations as these corruption cases unfold. We Saudis deserve more than the spectacle of royals and officials interned at the Ritz-Carlton. We also should have the right to speak about these important and impactful changes and the many more needed to achieve the Crown Prince's vision for our country. Jamal welcomed the Crown Prince's efforts to curb religious extremism and extremists who held back progress in the country for so many decades, but bemoaned the new extremism taking hold in the country. He said, while MBS is right to free Saudi Arabia from ultra-conservative religious forces, he is wrong to advance a new radicalism that, while seemingly more liberal and appealing to the West, is just as intolerant of dissent. Religious fanaticism that had tarnished Saudi Arabia's image for decades has given way to a new and perhaps more pernicious fanaticism, a cult of blind loyalty to our leader. Jamal was very clear and correct, I believe, that the growing exclusion of Islamists from the political sphere was certain to increase, not decrease, extremism and instability, and to ensure the failure of political progress in the region. He took pains to note the decades-long role of Islamists, many who had fled repression in Egypt, in helping modernize the kingdom as advisors to the royal family, helping distance them from the harsh Wahhabi establishment. Yet attacks on perceived Islamists, mostly because they represented a popular and influential voice in Saudi society, were an early target of the Crown Prince's attacks, on the heels of the Saudi government's support for the orchestrated overthrow of Egypt's first democratically elected president, the Muslim Brotherhood-aligned Mohammed Morsi. He said, the eradication of the Muslim Brotherhood is nothing less than an abolition of democracy and a guarantee that Arabs will continue living under authoritarian and corrupt regimes. In turn, this will mean the continuation of the causes behind revolution, extremism, and refugees, all of which have affected the security of Europe and the rest of the world. Terrorism and the refugee crisis have changed the political mood in the West and brought the extreme right to prominence there. It seems clear then that the only way to prevent political Islam from playing a role in Arab politics is to abolish democracy, which essentially deprives citizens of their basic right to choose their political representatives. Meanwhile, Jamal noted the pretty funny irony of the Saudi press breathlessly covering the protests that erupted in Iran in 2018 in an apparent love for public demonstrations only across the border. He said, indeed, many Saudis must find it contradictory for their media to hail Iranians protesting price increases in Iran while Saudis are banned from protesting the approximately doubled cost of fuel and the introduction of a sales tax for the first time in the country. Just last week, Saleh Shehi, a prominent columnist, was arrested for appearing on TV and defending the people's right to object. The time has come for MBS to be freed from his fear of democracy and the true Arab Spring, as well as from his justified concerns of Iranian expansionism. What's to stop Saudis from wondering why state-approved celebrations of freedom, democracy, and justice are reserved for Iranians? Jamal shared the perception of probably most Saudis that the Houthi takeover in Yemen was a sign of a troubling expansion of Iranian influence, a view I think was wrong. He initially supported Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, but he came to criticize the disastrous execution that failed to stem the Houthis, wasted tremendous national resources, depleting the national budget, including a third of the national reserves, at an estimated cost of $200 million a day over the past 4.5 years, and harmed Saudi Arabia's global reputation in the face of the staggering human suffering it has been inflicting on the people of Yemen. He attributed these failures to the country's inexperienced, reckless, and poorly educated crown prince, alongside a whole series of his rather bizarre and rash regional skirmishes. Jamal wrote, "The impulsivity of MBS has been a consistent theme, from the war in Yemen to the wave of arrests of constructive critics, royals, and senior officials accused of corruption. The severity of Saudi Arabia's action against Lebanon mirrors the blockade of Qatar in June, abrupt, with no room for negotiation." Jamal was open in viewing the region through a sectarian lens, Sunni versus Shia, and his own Sunni orientation. He identified it primarily as a product of the earthquake, as he called it, of the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the establishment of an Islamic republic rivaling Saudi's Islamic monarchy. He noted to me the way in which Saudis were taught at an early age to see Iranians as their nemesis. I believe it's this orientation that led him to urge the US government to intervene more forcefully in Syria and to urge Syria's partition along Sunni, Alawi, Shia lines. I believe he misread America's political direction at the time, which had zero interest in expanding its Syria footprint, and indulged a massive blind spot to repeated American failures in Middle East interventions. So we deeply disagreed on this as well. And yet Jamal saw clearly the need for rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Before his death, I introduced him to an Iranian human rights activist, with hopes that they could form the foundations of a citizen-to-citizen exchange. He confessed that this was the first time he had sat down and discussed politics with an Iranian, but was enthusiastic about pressing for increased engagement. In what was his last op-ed, published as a draft posthumously, Jamal urged both Saudi Arabia and Iran to stop meddling in the affairs of neighboring countries, citing the disastrous wars in Syria and Yemen, and to start investing in the advancement of their people, particularly the youth, by respecting their rights. He urged the creation of a Saudi-Iranian civil society dialogue to counter the divisive and harmful rhetoric of their governments with reason and moderation. Boy, do we need that today. Jamal's mission in his life was to strive for democracy and freedom for all of the Arab world. He remained committed to ensuring that Saudi was the kingdom of silence, as he called it, no longer. And it was that very mission, that very commitment, that made the Crown Prince perceive him as an existential threat. I don't wish to review the heinous details of Jamal's abduction, torture, murder, and dismemberment 1 year ago today. We are fortunate to have ample evidence about the Saudi government's actions to plan and execute this murder, mostly due to their botched amateur actions. We have a thorough investigation by the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, Agnes Callamard. We have the findings of the CIA investigation attributing direct culpability for ordering the killing to Mohammed bin Salman and his chief advisor, Saud al-Qahtani. When John Bolton and other Americans refused to listen to the leaked surveillance audio of Jamal's final minutes, complaining that they were in Arabic, Columbia University professor Hamid Dabashi responded in an essay. How does one scream in Arabic? He wrote that Jamal's last sounds were not in Arabic or any particular language, but rather were the primordial cries of a people from one end of the Arab and Muslim world to the next, maligned and brutalized by a sustained history of tyrannical abuse. Initially, the Saudi government offered various brazen, fumbling lies and denials about killing Jamal, including dressing up a body double and trotting him into Istanbul streets to pretend Jamal had departed, tisk-tisking the coincidentally malfunctioning security cameras throughout the consulate that ensured there was no video footage. But with the relentless evidence that emerged, just too many smoking guns to recite here, the Saudi government was finally forced to acknowledge that its agents had carried out the murder of Jamal. Their only remaining ploy is to shield the Crown Prince from personal accountability. They have relied on an ever-shifting narrative of rogue agents, together with a slow-moving, secretive show trial of the low-level officials implicated in the murder. Despite phone records detailing the role of the Crown Prince's closest advisor, Saud al-Qahtani, in ordering Jamal's capture and killing, he remains, to our knowledge, a free man. But last week, the Crown Prince admitted to at least some responsibility. It happened under my watch. I get all the responsibility because it happened under my watch. His admission is certainly in line with international law, which holds a state responsible for the unlawful acts of its agents acting in their official capacity, in this case, the deliberate, premeditated, and extrajudicial execution of a government critic. And for international crimes such as torture, commanders up to the highest level, that means the Crown Prince, can be held liable for crimes committed by their subordinates under the principle of command responsibility. It's clear that the Saudi government grossly miscalculated the global consequences, particularly for the Crown Prince, of their botched murder and botched cover-up. It may not yet have resulted in criminal liability, but it has certainly produced other forms of accountability, by way of the massive reputational, political, and economic costs to him and his government, including the total waste of hundreds of millions of dollars spent, using public funds, of course, on lobbyists to bolster his global image. The US, UK, Canada, Germany, and a number of other states moved quickly to impose sanctions by way of travel bans and asset freezes against up to 17 of the implicated officials, unsurprisingly excluding the Crown Prince, but including Qahtani and the Saudi consul in Istanbul, Mohammed al-Otaibi. Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Finland enacted, at last, long-debated arms embargoes against Saudi Arabia. The murder made possible the impossible. Solid bipartisan action in a deeply divided American Congress, which passed not one but 3 bills to suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia for its war crimes in Yemen, vetoed by Donald Trump, alas. The House of Representatives this July passed a bill, still pending, to condition approval of the defense budget on a report for those responsible for killing Jamal and punishment against them. The legislative and political fallout in the United States is far from over. The Saudi government has sought shelter in the bearish embrace of Donald Trump, relying on him to shield them by vetoing these laws and ensuring continued support. But whether it's 1 more year or 5 more years, this administration will not last. And given the American public's anger, it is doubtful that Saudi will have protection under any new administration. The Crown Prince also faced a threatened investigation for torture and extrajudicial killing, supported by my organization, when he turned up for the G20 in Argentina last year, but remained in his hotel room, and has not dared to show his face in the US or Europe, where he will likely face more lawsuits. There are indeed multiple lawsuits to force the disclosure of government information tied to this murder. Prominent celebrities, like Nicki Minaj even, have canceled appearances. And just last month, the New York Public Library canceled an event for the Crown Prince's Misk Foundation following public outrage. The stench of association with the Saudi government persists. Saudi citizens have suffered from the shock and shame of their government's actions. As one Saudi told me, he crossed a red line. We knew our government would jail dissidents, but we never imagined this level of barbarism and criminality and scandal, to not only abduct and kill Jamal, a moderate, but to cut up his body and lie about it. This is to say nothing of what the Crown Prince has paid on behalf of Saudi citizens to buy American acquiescence, playing a role, an approving role in the so-called peace plan for Palestine. I suspect that the apparent naivete, perhaps the willful blindness that harm might come to Jamal, of even sophisticated figures like Prince Walid and Prince Turki, reflects the extent to which Jamal's murder undermined Saudis' sense of themselves. The murder of Jamal catapulted the Crown Prince's status from an asset to a liability for the kingdom, as a reckless, impulsive, inexperienced, and I will say again, pretty darn sadistic leader. As the trials of activists, many facing the death penalty, continue, as the kingdom continues to sink in the quicksand of Yemen, as it skirmishes with even friendly governments like Canada, and as the toll for murdering Jamal continues to ring, more and more Saudis realize just how much the Crown Prince has harmed their country. More important, however, than the cost of Jamal's murder is what he was able to contribute, particularly in his final year of life on this planet. Despite the tremendous personal costs he paid, Jamal persisted in his advocacy for freedom and democracy. He had recently established an organization, Democracy for the Arab World Now, or DAWN, of which I'm a board member, to pursue his vision. As his close friend recounted to me, Jamal wanted Saudis to wake up and to shake the status quo. He shook it. He expected his work to deliver a message of reform to take decades. Instead, it was delivered in months, with the world reciting his calls. I think Jamal can rightly claim credit for helping usher in the reforms we've seen this year and last, including ending the bans on women driving and traveling freely. The speed with which Saudi has delivered on these is testament to the pressure they've felt to improve the Crown Prince's damaged image. And the Crown Prince's acceptance of responsibility is an important opening in our ongoing pursuit for justice for Jamal. The debt we owe to Jamal, the best way to honor his legacy, is to dedicate our efforts to driving a truck through this opening. It is, after all, the loud and relentless demands of civil society, the free press, advocacy groups, activists, and the general outraged public that have forced the Saudi government, the American government, the British government, and others to offer at least some reckoning for what's happened under the Crown Prince's rule. We can look to the recommendations of Ms. Calamard's UN report to shape our demands for accountability, compensation, and guarantee that the Saudi government will not repeat its misdeeds. This means an independent, impartial, and public investigation of all those implicated in the murder to uncover exactly what happened, which the Saudi government, by the way, has promised but failed to deliver. This should include finally telling us where it has hidden Jamal's body so that his family can give him a proper burial. Ms. Calamard called for a UN criminal investigation, particularly in light of Saudi Arabia's non-cooperation with her investigation. Will the Saudi government now cooperate, given the Crown Prince's admission, allowing access to evidence and relevant persons in the kingdom? The Saudi government should also move to remedy those injured by its crime by apologizing, which it has not yet done, to Jamal's friends, family, and associates, so deeply wounded by this attack. and the US and Turkish governments for murdering a US resident on Turkish soil. It must compensate those harmed, not with secretive payoffs in Saudi Arabia in exchange for familial silence, but as an admission of wrongdoing. Most importantly, the Saudi government must prove to its citizens and the international community that it will not repeat its crimes and continue its suppression of free expression. Its record since Jamal's murder, including the continued detention and prosecution of women's rights activists like Loujain al-Hathloul and Mohammed Rabi'a, to name but two of scores of Saudi voices of reform, instead indicates that it continues to punish critical voices with impunity. To convince anyone otherwise requires the immediate release of these jailed activists whose cause Jamal had taken on as his own. Of course, there are a host of reforms required to ensure Saudis can speak freely, including revamping its intelligence forces that targets dissidents and establishing laws that enshrine their rights, a penal code that articulates elements of real crimes, and an independent judiciary. But releasing those now languishing in prison is the most urgent. It must also end its unlawful surveillance and threats against government critics at home and abroad, notwithstanding its distorted efforts to label such surveillance as the catch-all counterterrorism. Until such time as it commits to this, with independent oversight, governments must ban the transfer of surveillance technology to the kingdom. We must insist that businesses operating in the kingdom ensure, with thorough due diligence, that their operations will not contribute to or benefit from human rights abuses in the kingdom, including discrimination against women and minorities. PR firms, lobbyists, and law firms bear a major responsibility here, assisting the kingdom as they have in sweeping its wrongdoings under the rug. Businesses operating in Saudi Arabia can dedicate a portion of their profits to organizations fighting for press freedom, women's rights, and human rights. The international community, that's us, should continue to press their governments to fulfill their own obligations to hold Saudi Arabia accountable and to honor Jamal's memory with memorials like the one we have today, events and scholarships in his name. As I noted last year, one day I hope Saudis will build a memorial for Jamal in their own country. He gave them much to be proud for. Most importantly, we honor Jamal by supporting his most cherished goal, freedom and democracy for the Arab world. I close with the words of Karen Atiyah, Jamal's editor at the Washington Post. If Jamal were alive, he might have been heartened by the chorus of Arabic cries coming from the streets of Sudan and more recently the streets of Cairo. I will add Algeria and Iraq here too. These cries of hope and resistance are a demonstration of the power the people can still wield. And perhaps enduring justice for Jamal will come on the very day that the Saudi people themselves will scream loudly for the world to hear that they deserve better and that the bargain they have been presented with, complicity with the regime or death, is one they will no longer accept. We want Saudi Arabia to be the kingdom of silence no longer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a tour d'horizon, but also the way you used so many stories about Jamal and quotes from him, I thought not only honored him in a wonderful way, but it gave all of us a kind of image of how different another Saudi Arabia could be. So thank you so much. Now, our second guest is Sue Turton, who for 30 years has been a distinguished and award-winning TV presenter and a war correspondent on many fronts. She had her own experience of the region's despots' crackdown on independent journalism when she was working in the Arab Spring for Al Jazeera. She was one of a number of Al Jazeera journalists who were convicted of aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation. She was tried in absentia, but various of her colleagues were given long prison terms, and Sue led the campaigns to keep their memories alive in prison and supported them in every possible way. Unfortunately, she had to leave her job in Al Jazeera, which required travel, and it would have required her to go to a number of countries that had extradition treaties with Egypt. Anyway, Al Jazeera's loss is our gain. She's now the series editor for Channel 4's wonderful Unreported World series. So I strongly recommend that, and I welcome her now. Thank you, Sue.